We were just some dumb seniors in high school when we found out. A rowdy bunch that largely did nothing except drink and ignore the lessons being taught. It was only the three of us, the hick kids, Jonathan, Mason, and Enzo. On the weekends, we would go up into the mountains, find a spot to camp, and stay up late drinking till dawn. Not until our usual camping spot was taken did we have to hunt for a new one. After driving over the mountains, we came to a place that resembled a farm. The location was nearly an abandoned farm, with not much left of it. It was just barely livable. There were a few trash relics from the last campers. Still, it was worth it for the vast field with lots of space to run about. Before the sun fell, we attempted playing football on the field. It was clearly a death trap when Mason stumbled over a soft spot in the field and nearly broke his foot. He sank almost all the way up to his leg, where he suffered a very bad injury. We tried to return to the fields to play a different game when we first discovered it at night, but we were pushed back by an invisible force. Startled by what we saw, we tried again and ran into the center of the field, only to have Enzo knocked back by the force. The closer one got to the center, the stronger the force. It got easier everywhere you tried it, as it looped around the field in all directions. Like how opposite sides of a magnet will oppose one another when positioned in close proximity. Needless to say, we pushed each other to our limits and had the best night ever on that particular occasion. In our inebriated fog, we would run very fast and then be flung back. It never got old watching your drunk friend's body take off into the sky. In the morning, the field seemed to be back to normal. We checked the field again to see if anything had changed, but we found nothing. After that, we would camp there every time we went to see how near we could go to the center of the storm. We eventually developed more resourcefulness and started bringing weights and ice axes. Jonathan tried crashing a four-wheeler that was going full speed into a force. Needless to say, that night he wound up in the ER. Each of us secretly suspected that we were testing fate and tinkering with unexplained events. But our curiosity got the better of us, and the idea of going into the storm's core inspired us to work even harder. Ultimately, despite our best efforts, none of us managed to really arrive at the center. Not until our last camping trip prior to graduation did things change. That time, it felt different. We were exhausted and had barely passed all of our final tests, earning a C. Compared to previous nights, this one was more tranquil. Honestly, none of us wanted to go against the flow. Most of the time, we just sat and had beer and talked about the previous several years. After that night, there was probably no way we would see each other again. I didn't want to waste our last minutes worrying about our issues. I was desperate to try getting inside the circle again that evening. With a deep inhale of liquid bravery, I made my way over to the field. I thought that everyone was focusing on me. Their hushed murmurs made me question my chances of surviving. I had always been the least strong person in the group and had trouble getting to the middle. This time, though, I felt compelled to query God's judgment and go above and beyond. I walked cautiously into the field, but as soon as the force gained control, I stumbled back and almost fell flat. But I just plodded on, going on without stopping. Before long, my skin was getting cut as I crawled and gripped the dense grass in front of me. Even though my hands were bleeding, the pain made me want the prize even more. Even though I could feel the pressure building inside my chest, it made me want to keep going. I shut my eyes and focused solely on pushing myself further than I had gone before. My body sprang up into the air, and the only thing holding me down was my grip on the earth. It began to feel like God was pushing me out of my chest. I exerted all of my strength forward till the pressure eventually subsided. Then there was quiet, a brief period of time when nothing moved on earth. I was tired but yet relieved that I had reached the center. Not even a four-wheeler could have done it. The silence was broken by the sound of my buddies running toward me and cheering. Jonathan snatched me up and cried out in excitement that I had come. And then Mason showed up, both of them carrying me on their shoulders and spinning me around and screaming underdog. More than anything, Enzo was just unhappy that I had ruined the good time and stood there, It seemed like I had won the Super Bowl. I had never felt more successful than I did that day. I still remember the event for tough moments. If only I had known that my bravery would lead to our ruin. 2 days later, I got the call. Mason was found dead at his girlfriend's place. I didn't truly feel scared until I saw my friend's disfigured corpse. Where his chest had been yanked outward, there was a rip in it. His broken rib cage were scattered over the room, along with bits of flesh and bone. There was almost no blood left on the walls. His neck was almost cut as his head hung beneath the couch. His gray, lifeless eyes looked as though a screen was covering them. His expression was one of horror, as if he was living out his last moments and witnessing death directly. The autopsy reported that the lungs were missing and had not been located. The lungs seemed as if they had never existed in the first place. Mason's fiancée, Anna, had mentioned the night before his death that her parents were out of town on business, so he would be spending the night. But when he got there, he was obviously hurt, so he thought maybe he had eaten something. He tried not to wake the neighbors by keeping quiet the whole night, but he was perspiring profusely. Anna tried everything to get Mason to go to the hospital, but eventually she gave up and went to bed. She was startled awake by a loud popping sound. When she went to check on him, that's how she found him. Anna was the main suspect, but since there was no evidence of a break-in, the death was ruled a homicide. If the second incident hadn't happened, she probably would have been found guilty. Next was Enzo. It happened while he was buying drugs from the place where his plug was located. Enzo entered the store late and clutched his chest, according to dealer Jack. He was getting so sweaty that he looked as pale as a ghost. Every now and again he staggered wildly, almost falling as if someone had pushed him back. Jack finally concluded that giving him a blunt would help him relax. As Jack took a breath, he noticed that the smoke went into his body, but did not leave. Then Enzo just stopped, lying on the couch almost still, his eyes glassy. In a whisper, he murmured something to himself. Jack could only make out a few phrases when he got close. Hands feel cold. Then his chest exploded like a bomb, sending bones, organs, and guts flying across the room and dousing Jack in blood. After Enzo's second death, Jonathan and I concluded that if we did nothing, we would die next. We returned to the field place in the automobile. There has to be something we missed because I hadn't seen anything since that evening. After we arrived, I went back to my original location and recollected how I had arrived at the center. There was nothing that explained the entire circumstance, and then I realized the night was over. I lived that night trying to get to the core. It hadn't rained in days. In that case, there should have been dried blood. I started to excavate after attempting to pinpoint the spot where I was bleeding as best I could. Jonathan came to dig with me till we were left with numb hands. The earth underneath got moist and heavy. As soon as we recognized we were moving blood, our hands turned red instead of brown. Before long, blood started to eclipse dirt. I felt the damp earth with my fingertips and then plunged them in the blood. There was a hard, slick piece of flesh beneath the dirt that I could hardly feel breathing. I had to take long, labored breaths, and I could feel the blood in my arms slightly rising and sinking. The discovery of God had infuriated him. The force never came from the sky. It always started below. That was its air that I had taken in my will to face her. She's taking ours now, one by one, as a kind of punishment. Before I could say another word, I looked up at Jonathan and saw the dread in his eyes and his hands clenched around his chest. We tried wiping our hands in the grass to try to get the blood off them before sprinting to the car. While we were driving, he informed me it seemed like someone was picking at him. It got worse. Even though he tried to act normal, I could tell he was in terrible pain. We eventually found the nearest emergency room, and I pleaded with the receptionist to make an appointment for Jonathan to see a doctor. As soon as we entered a room, his eyes went white and glossed over. He went into something of a trance, totally oblivious to anything I said. Then he lost it and screamed at me, saying I was the one who was going to put God to the test and damn the whole world. He leaped out of bed, grabbed me, and sank his nails into my chest. Staff had to strap him to the bed and put him in restraints. The doctor could only acquire a chest scan at that moment. I was both amazed and terrified by what I witnessed. On the picture, 2 hands could be seen as silhouettes drawing near to the lungs. They merely rearranged Jonathan's internal organs by pushing the other organs aside. The hands crept gradually toward the center of Jonathan's lungs, and with every push came a moan of agony. Reaching the storm's eye, where his lungs were trapped, took them several minutes. Jonathan's eyes suddenly turned gray and took on the same color. He turned to face me, his face a jumble of defeat and frustration. All he said was that it was freezing. Not that I was watching him. I was unsuccessful at it. As I was leaving the room, I heard the doctor scream, and then the crunching sound of tearing skin and bone. I drove home, hearing Jonathan crunching over and over in my head. I grabbed my dad's old, beat-up shotgun from the shed, along with a shovel and a lamp, before heading back out into the field. When I got there, it was so dark I couldn't even make out where I was. I felt the familiar old energy as I stumbled towards the fields. I pushed and tried the same things I had tried the night before, but I couldn't reach the middle with the additional weight. With every attempt, I was able to get farther away. I was wearing myself out trying to hit back, but I was unable to do it under any circumstances. My worst fear came true as soon as I felt the cool touch on my chest. Time was not on my side. At that point, I just had the shotgun slung to my back and left the shovel and lamp behind. I closed my eyes, stepping back from any grief or fear, focusing just on the core of the storm. With everything I had left, I pushed forward until my hands began to bleed, and I was crawling on all fours, clinging to the ground. Until, with a final shove, the force finally stopped. I fell to the ground, exhausted but unyielding in my resolve. I sank my teeth into the ground with what was left of me. The pressure building on my chest made me feel as though the hands were attempting to tear into my flesh. The further I descended, the bloodier it became until, finally, I touched the bottom again. My fingers dipped into the blood, searching for actual flesh. Instead, I felt like a meaty, thick tube. Using both hands, I tore the tube upward just past the blood. I observed it rise and fall in my palms as the air passed through it at a rapidly increasing speed. It was the trachea, the principal tube of the lung. Ready to tear the thing apart before I dropped it, I clutched at my chest. My lungs were being gripped by it. My body felt cold, and my vision went fuzzy. I blasted madly into the pit below, holding my shotgun. Earth shook and blood poured back into my face. With each blast, I could feel the rumbling of screaming coming from below. I continued till my chest pressure decreased and my vision returned to normal. Finally, exhausted, I closed my eyes, sunk back, and dozed out on the chilly grass. When I woke up, the morning was warm. One last time, I dipped my fingers into the earth to look for signs of life. God has vanished. As time passed, the field progressively shriveled and eventually died in a matter of days. With miles ahead of them, and no sign of life, the desert followed. As time went on, I personally discovered how to let go of the past. For a very long time, I was content and never worried about God coming back. It wasn't until late last night that I felt the cool touch of God on my chest once more. I'm too far away from the fields to stop her in the end. Thus she won. For a very long time, she has been waiting impatiently for her opportunity to get revenge. I can already feel death's cold grip tightening around my lungs, ready to pull at any moment, even though she's making me wait. Whether she's enjoying every second before it catches up with me or not, or perhaps she's waiting for me to finish so she can caution everyone from making the same mistake I did. Even if it were to kill me, I would not give it the satisfaction of fear. I'll give it everything I've got to face her, finding strength in the hope my friends gave me last night and in their celebration of me. So I have no voice in this, no, in a word. My mother drove too fast, giving the impression that she was anxious to get away from me. It was difficult for her to drive quickly in Manhattan's Upper East Side traffic, but she managed to do so. I believe that America was meant to be the land of the free. I said, "You are just 14 years old, though. And Roman law, upon which women and children are the property of men, to be disposed of, is the basis of American legal philosophy. Oh, please, don't waste your post-punk feminist thoughts on me. I was burning bras before I knew you were here. Your father is entitled to 1 weekend per month, and that is what we are doing in accordance with the court decision." The court was unimpressed since, when Mom refused to bring me last month, citing my safety as her justification. He had already determined that there was no risk to my safety. He was going to throw my mother in jail for being disrespectful. Her lawyer successfully persuaded him, and then presented her with a $2,000 bill for his efforts. Apparently, my safety was too important to jeopardize. I might as well dress up since I would be seeing my creepy father, I thought to myself. So I dressed in black knee-high boots, black cargo shorts, and a leather jacket, black lipstick, black sunglasses, black fingerless gloves, silver nose ring, and black nose ring. All that was free of black was my nose. My mother pulled her car over to the side of the road in front of my father's building. The main access was at a U-shaped drive beneath the building, where you could drop off or leave your keys for the valet. I said, "You know you can pull into the drive." "Sure, and instruct the doorman to make sure your car is unlocked when you depart. I'll pick you up at 5 on Sunday. Step outside." I said, "Salt maybe," and left the room to end the conversation. How about if it's pouring? You're not sugar-coated. I just walked away, taking my revenge without looking back to make sure I got the short wave, Blum kiss, and other nuances. "Good afternoon, Miss Vasilik," the doorman remarked as he opened the door for me. "I'll let your dad know you're here. Why did he give you my photo or something like that?" "So," I asked. "It's my business to know your father's callers," he said with a smile that technically avoided answering my question. After I eventually made my way inside the empty elevator, I noticed that it just had 2 buttons, door open and door close. However, the elevator started to move as soon as the doors close. It appears that you could only use the elevator in locations where the doorman gave you permission to do so. A young man with a rumpled suit and long hair fashioned in cornrows was seen when the door opened. "Nicole?" and he asked. I asked, "What, you didn't notice my photo?" "Of course I got your picture," he replied. "I just thought it would be polite to ask." In this way, he proceeded down the hallway. Through the arch on the left, I could see my father in the library, where he appeared to be chatting with a few older, well-dressed guys. My escort left me behind. My father turned around, and I waved a hand at him. He continued, "Your father's in a meeting right now. Leave me to lead you to your room. Should I wait to be called upon somewhere?" "So?" I asked. "Yes," he answered. "Is it a problem?" "Yes, it is a problem," I answered. He whispered, "It stinks to you," and turned away. He led me to the enormous guest room at the back of the apartment, with a queen-sized bed covered in black silk sheets, and I followed him because, really, what kind of company did you usually host? I mean, it was useless to fight if he wasn't going to fight back. I fell onto my bed, threw my suitcase in the corner, and put on a song. This was stupid. Even though my father might have just wanted me to make a claim about my mother, he would have to deal with me if he had won me. At least I didn't have to wonder if, or how much to tip my escort when he left without saying a word. I got up and walked back into the corridor, and to my utter amazement, there was a group of men singing in the library. I had no idea that my father was the leader of a dark underworld of barbershops. A strange music played, notes that rose and fell freely. Listening to it again, it sounded more like Gregorian chant than barbershop. The air smelled strongly of something pungent, like incense, but with a meatier, smokier scent, like pork and frankincense burnt on a wood fire. As I stepped through the doorway, they were all standing in a circle, their hands clasped and raised. My father's flaming face and thrown-back head caught my attention, but what really stood out was his chest. Big men have always been my father's style. He was over 6 feet tall, square in build, and had the muscular bulk of a prize fighter. But now he was swollen, literally. Huge protuberances developed in his deltoids, cascading down his arms and reaching his gloved fingertips. His collar broke. Yes, he was still wearing a collar that buttoned on, but something swelled beneath it, making him look like Sigourney Weaver from a science fiction program. Then the chanting ended abruptly. My dad closed his mouth, and the two thin tentacles simply disappeared, without retracting. My dad let out a choking cry and opened his mouth, forcing them to stretch and twist in midair. The girl beside me, an elderly man, said, "She saw. She observed. But what if she did?" Me dad said something. "Is a woman's look ruining our wedding?" "She's aware. Yes, she knows. If she goes to the police and says she heard her father say Shaknorath's ominous name, how will we handle it?" "Perhaps I'll have to rescue her from this madhouse," I declared. I saw tentacles. My father's chest remained still as he replied, "Maybe a wisp of smoke." He replaced his collar. "We will be ready to begin putting our plan into action at our next meeting or the one after that." Gentlemen, we had a late afternoon meeting, but it was fruitful. "Ramon, get my daughter something to drink and make sure she stays in the kitchen." "What, are you putting me away once more?" My father turned to face me. He flashed, staring at me with his massive eyes. "Yes, I will package you up. I acknowledge what you have seen, but don't try to contradict me in this instance." "Perhaps not," I said, feeling silly for pushing my luck, but unable to stop myself. "Will you kick me out? Mom would probably want to turn back and come get me, but I doubt she's halfway home. While I wait, how about I just stand on the corner and talk to the Johns?" "No," was his reply. "We're going to spend the rest of the weekend learning about the importance of compliance, but I won't kick you out." For a brief moment, I was oblivious to his identity. My father had vanished, replaced by a black and bloody shadow demon. His features were barely different, but for a split second, they moved, swelled, and then settled back where they had been, erroneously. After that moment, he was my father again. Who was that? I followed Ramon into the kitchen. "What do you have on tap?" and he asked. I cried out in anger, "Vodka." He asked if it was straight or on rocks. I looked again, to be honest. "I'll get you something to drink and make sure you stay here," he said. "I give the orders." "I'm 14. Isn't that right?" Hook his head. "You might be surprised to hear this, but I'm not a cop." Laughed. "Is that vodka still what you want?" And he asked. "I'm a serious martini maker." Pondered over it. "Perhaps a little bit. A little martini or a little vodka." Masty. He moved across the kitchen to get the shaker and a stemmed cocktail glass with the ease of someone he knew. In a moment, he handed me an olive and perhaps 2 tablespoons of alcohol. I had a drink. It was strange. Simultaneously flamboyant, floral, glossy, and briny. I kind of enjoyed it, except for the burn coming down. "Oh, know how I feel?" After asking a quick question, he started mixing. "It's definitely attractive," I said, "but one is sufficient." "More than enough," he muttered. "This isn't your thing. So, do you belong to the secret cable or something else?" "No, me. I just help your father out with his work." "Ike surrounding his daughter?" I asked. "Sometimes I'll help him with an issue the next time. Sometimes I'll shine his shoes and take his coat to be cleaned." "Yes," I said, feigning to shoot a handgun into his temple. "An issue? Were you really of the opinion that your father would participate in something like this?" "I'm not sure how far it goes when you start talking about satanic cults and black magic. Atan is not worshipped here. This is a political project. Their intention is to turn the country around. I'm not convinced that it's going in the right way by anything you say. You don't operate a pedophile network out of a New Jersey pizzeria, do you?" "Ear God. You came across us," Ramon laughed. 'Twas then that my father came in. He looked at Ramon and scowled at me. "What is in her drink, anyway?" "A martini," I immediately remarked, reminding Ramon that your instructions were to make me a drink, but he refused. "I see that I need to give clear directions," my father said, taking the second martini from Ramon, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Nickel, you've seen the terrible secrets of your father. You know how I feel. I'm not certain. Will you be making any virgin sacrifices? If we did, would you be in danger? If I were, would I be in danger? My father grinned and said, "Well done." Of course not. This society is full of aimless virgin girls. Why give up my own when someone else can perform just as well? Peter S. Beagle once said, "Real magic can never be made with someone else's liver." I decided not to bring it up. My father feigned amusement, as if it were all a joke. We laughed together, and I forced myself to believe. He replied, "Let's go to dinner." "What do you want to have?" In French, italic. "Sushi," I murmured, knowing it would be expensive. Wherever my father took me, it would definitely be expensive, but whatever. We went to get dinner. My father only laughed and didn't seem to grasp when I asked him to elaborate on his cover plot. It took me 3 tries to figure out that the topic was off limits. But I didn't answer his nice questions about my classes, my hobbies, and most importantly, the boys I liked. So the conversation went slowly and awkwardly until he finally disclosed to me his official position as a lobbyist for private institutions and academic interests. He laughed when I said that I was unaware that there was a historians' lobby. Although we are not the most powerful lobby within the Beltway, everyone needs an advocate to speak for them. He went home after dinner, where I fell asleep on the black silk sheets while we watched Lawrence of Arabia till the wee hours of the morning. In the morning, my father was there with bagels, lox, and espresso. I sat with him in the kitchen as he drew a 5-pointed star on a piece of paper. He drew an eye in the center of the star and said, "Then put yourself at the center. That little will protect you if you do it right, with full intention. You go in the 5 directions. From left, right, after left, to 4. Then, without lifting your pen, compass the entire earth. It must be round and precisely pass through each of the 5 spots." Sincerely, I asked, "You ought to be aware of how to defend yourself if you have any knowledge of what I do, which you already do. And I use a Dixon Ticonderoga No. 2, or do I need to draw it in blood?" In the morning, everything had looked so real and scary. The previous evening seemed absurd. "You would find our actions funny?" my dad inquired. "Who among you has seen? Hat was it that I saw?" So I asked, "Are you eating an octopus?" Wonderful. "How certain are you that no magic was used?" Hesitated. Of course I hadn't seen any magic, because there was no magic. Was I that sure, though? "I see," my father replied, as if he could read my thoughts. Did he? "You are a young, gullible person. You're not a believer. It's evident that you deny the existence of magic. Still, are you certain?" "Of course not. Of course, you'd have to believe in logic and science. Furthermore, you have 0 beliefs. Because you never make a mistake, and you never assert something as true. You are smarter than everyone else." That resembled the genuine thing quite closely. I wasn't particularly interested in verifying if it was accurate because it was so close. "Make the elder sign," my father said to me. "Today." Next I drew. "Try it again." You severed the after right and totally missed the appropriate position. I tried it again. Again, without cutting your circle in half. It took me 2 more tries before I could win him over with just 1. "That's okay," he answered. "Fortunately for you, your religion will shield you if you make the right decisions, and with that intention, it is not stronger than the older sign. Why are you showing me this?" So I asked. "Why exactly? Are you my apprentice? My trainee? Or maybe you're just my daughter? I have a soft spot for you as a curious and daring young person. The difficult part of being bold and inquisitive is accepting that there is actually something to be afraid of." My mother came right away to fetch me up after I spent the rest of the day at the Museum of Fine Art. 1 month later, the process was repeated. I was impeding and not on board with what we needed to accomplish if I didn't want to go, but I would be taking sides against her if I went. My mother is someone you can never win. She looked skeptically at me as she maneuvered through traffic. "You don't seem to be complaining as much about this visit. Because I had so much fun drinking cocktails with his mobster friends last time, I joked. She said, "This doesn't have to be harder than it needs to be." That is questionable in my opinion. If that were my only option, didn't it imply that I had to make things difficult? On the other side, I could keep my clever repartees to myself, which is probably the help that she would appreciate most. You know, I could probably end these visits if I chose to believe those remarks, my mother replied after a little silence. That ended my well-intentioned self-control. What was the intended meaning of that anyway? Should she opt to believe my word? In other words, was she capable of believing me if she so wished, but she was simply not in the mood? If hiring a lawyer for $2,000 was worth it, I answered. She left me outside again, and this time the doorman smiled and greeted me like I was one of his regular customers, which I knew was an affectation, but still, he was so good at it that I couldn't help but enjoy the game. This time, Raymond met me at the elevator and told me to go straight to the library, and he would take my bag to my room. The same bunch of men, or at least similar ones, surrounded the room in dark suits, and someone pulled me into the circle. My father said, "No, not beside me," or the opposite. I squeaked in between my father and myself by pushing one geezer aside. "Not around any corner," my father said. "Circles don't have corners," I stated. My left-hand old man said, "This is not a good idea. You are endangering not just our goal but also us. Nicole, swap Sasha for yourself." Raymond had returned to the room. I saw, but he was standing well outside the circle, well inside the doorway, so I presumed this to be the man on my left, since trading places with him would bring me next to my father. My dad said, "We get started," and we clasped them above our heads and joined hands. They began chanting strange things again, and in the center of our circle stood a light leather skin that seemed like it might have come from a large goat or sheep rather than a pig or cow. Suddenly, I felt something moving around the circle. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but it kept getting stronger. It was a liquid, moving between us more like a liquid. It was thick, but it moved quickly, throwing us off balance if it wasn't on all sides at once. I was certain that if I let go of my neighbors, I would be thrown out of the circle. My father began to grow and bulge, almost the entire circle around me. From his open mouth, a thick, large tentacle of tongue extended and became thinner, encircling his entire forearm. The magnetism between us grew stronger and stronger, and before I knew it, I was holding on to my neighbor for dear life, fearing that if I let go, I would be thrown through the wall behind me. My father's tongue touched the middle hide, and the circle released all of its magical energy, causing the hide to expand and pulse with a faint, sluggish glow. When the magic stopped flowing, my knees buckled, and for a moment my vision turned gray as I broke the connection and fell to the ground. When my eyesight returned, the hide before me had swelled, a small, mottled, repulsive creature that looked like a slug. It thinned and fanned out, one end rising to a questing blunt point, and it seemed as though vague eye shapes sprang from its depths, peered through the translucent skin, and then slid away. "Take care. Take caution." My arm was grabbed by someone, and they raised me back up and away from the disgusting object. I had my father's word that she was okay. "I'm in charge of it." "Then send it out of here," muttered one of the older men. It was Raymond who pulled me out of the group. He kept holding me back. I pulled my arm away from him, just out of decency. "Are you terrified, Leonid?" my father asked. "Are you doubting my power?" It was like a double mattress after it had stretched out, easily able to enclose a whole man, enclosing him in a pulsating, living muscle, until the air eventually became stale and failed. Suddenly, the object turned to face the man who had just spoken. He made a reverse leap. His neighbors turned their backs on him. My dad laughed, and the men sprang back and yelled as the raised end swung around the circle, answering, "Do you all disbelieve me?" He knew exactly what he wanted, so why couldn't the others see it? The hideous, disgusting thing was under my father's power, and he wanted other people to acknowledge it. I stepped up and touched it, and it was giving way slightly. It was damp but firm. My father laughed again. All of your wisdom, your complete research. Nevertheless, the child approaches the Rokoth. I've given my explanation for why I wanted her in the circle. Sasha responded, yes, Anatoly, you control it. Now send it off to fulfill its mission. My dad said, yes, that is its purpose. Perhaps frighten someone else. Silent as a slug, the item moved across the floor, through the glass slider that was open, out onto the balcony and over the parapet. As a result, the group broke up. I was sent back to the kitchen, but this time Ramon was with me. This time, he prepared me a full-size martini. I said, it was really clear. They're so stupid. Ramon said to Nicole, as she entered the circle, Nicole, you're missing some details. What? I sampled the martini. It was easier to swallow this time. It is accessible by touch. If you touched it while they were all acting scared, he could laugh at them. But what if none of them had been afraid, had acted as if this were an innocuous object? He would have been laughed at. Why do you suppose my father would kill an old man only to get attention? So I asked. You've never met my father. Leandro gave a shrug. He may serve as an example without killing him. Know who your father is. I turned to face him. He was, of course, right. If it had enveloped him, smothered him for 2 minutes, and then released him weak and gasping for air, Sasha would have shown both his leadership and the horrific strength of the creature. Was my father really capable of acting so heartlessly? Did I comprehend my father? He went into the kitchen and accepted the drink that Ramon was offering. Nicole, how are you feeling at the moment? And he asked, is this just my late-night anxiety and imagination? Will you describe everything you did and saw this morning? I said, I guess we'll see in the morning. The current U.S. Congressman, John Mercer, is an old hand in the establishment, well-liked by many, and a sure thing for the lead. He faces a capable, young, and strong opponent who can help this country, but Mercer has no chance because he is well-liked by all, at ease and unable to lose. I suppose we will, he muttered. Look up the news. How would you put it? So I asked, because my opinion of what I knew was unsatisfactory. Nicole, is this really what happened? Did we summon our Rokoth from the Shadow Realm? I was terrified of my dad for the first time. I knew there was only going to be one answer to this question, and I wanted to know what would happen if I didn't give it. We'll see in the morning, I suppose, he laughed. I was restless and went to bed, but I was unable to sleep until late at night, when I decided to protect myself from bad spirits and torn a piece of paper from my notebook and carefully drew an elder sign on it before falling back asleep. Nothing exciting happened in the morning news. My father said nothing. We went to the planetarium and did the tourist thing. I didn't find out until right before my mother picked me up that John Mercer had died in his sleep. I wish I had reported him, but I had no idea what to say. It didn't sound good to say. My father performed a black magic rite and sent a giant slug monster to murder him. I could find my father guilty and hope the police would find evidence. But what evidence could they find when I would have to swear if I were asked to testify that my father was not near the crime scene? A week before our next arranged visit, I called my father. He asked, to whom do I owe this distinction? Attend, I replied. I'd rather not visit. This is incredibly unsatisfactory, in my opinion. Could you please explain the reason behind this change in sentiment? It's as though I would have desired to see him at all. Let's just say that I feel uncomfortable participating in some of the events. Yes, I recognize. This is a moral stance. I would want for us to discuss this more in person. Yes, that would require me to visit you again. Yes, indeed. One more time. We might meet together once more to discuss your concerns and find a solution that benefits us both. I said, it seems like a waste of a weekend. I won't be changing my mind. Joke with me. Here's the thing, though. You're 14 years old. Your parents' will is the only legal protection you have because you are a juvenile. You are essentially not fully human in legal respects. To cease visiting without a court order, you must have my permission. So, the choice is entirely yours. Next weekend, come chat to me, or file a family court petition. Get an attorney and cross your fingers." Of course I went. How else could I help? Inform the magistrate that my dad practiced black magic. We had dinner at a French restaurant that evening, where each dish was presented in small portions on big plates with inventive sauce swirls. My father was even bigger than I remembered, and he had an odd gait. He used to be almost too graceful and light for his size. Now his movements were sudden jerks, as though he was driven by scuffed gears. "So, Nicole," he said, "is it true that you want to cease our visits because you don't like what I'm doing?" "Enough that close," I said. Although I didn't usually speak in such a harsh manner, I did not support murder. Despite the fact that you are aware of their ultimate goal, an end to the needless suffering of our country. A restoration to effective government will reduce poverty, crime, and pollution. Thousands, tens, or even hundreds of thousands of lives are saved, and millions of lives are improved. Do you want to avoid this situation? I muttered, "I don't want to be involved in the murder." He said, smiling awkwardly, "Oh, but that's the part you are participating in. Remember, you played a part in the ascension of the Rakath. You contributed to the magic. But I was unaware of. Or didn't you? You entered the circle of the skin. You have no idea what it was or who had sent it. Did you think we were just going to be singing Kumbaya? When you touched the Rakath, did it feel like you were petting a kitten? Are you stating that in this instance, I was unaware of? As my father would say, you should have known. You also failed to act upon discovering that you had committed a crime, hiding it from authorities. Regardless of your role in the ceremony, this makes you an accessory in and of itself." I stared at my father, who my mother had always said was shrewd and ruthless. He said, "You consider yourself a rebel. However, you can now distinguish between a real revolutionary and a trendy-dressing adolescent." The last thing I said was, "You don't need me." It sounded weak even to my own ears. "Don't I?" And he asked, "Look at me, Nicole. Look at me with adult eyes, not childlike ones." This was a surprise to me. Did he intend for me to see this? That he had wrinkles now. Wrinkles on his mouth sides, gray streaks in his hair. That immediately behind his eyes there was something repulsive and sinister. That his body did not look solid, that his face slipped and reconstructed continually, shifting in some subtle, terrible way. That guy seemed to have a nest of serpents under his jacket, that he was constantly having to fight to maintain his composure. That ultimately, I knew, he would be overpowered and plunge into darkness, though I couldn't tell when. "Is my next victim someone who gets together in my study out of lust?" He said. "Who will be my successor?" "Not me." I said. "Then not you," he said. "However, you will continue to visit me." "However," I stated, "I won't participate in any more summoning of monsters." It was decided upon. However, late that night, he insisted on teaching me how to heal a rent between realms, which appeared like an innocuous thing to do, dashed any hope I could have had that it would put a stop to my involvement in dark arts. I learnt, but I also learned how to recognize thin borders and how they could be forced open or close. My father explained, better than harmless. If left unhealed, someone untrustworthy may utilize such a thing to inflict harm. Time passed, and every month I observed my father's features getting older and less distinct, and the churning under his jacket getting bigger. He also taught me more about the evil arts each month. The following month, he showed me how to levitate objects, which appeared like a harmless diversion, a party trick. The following month, he suggested teaching me how to control creatures. I said, "I don't think I want to learn that." We met in his dining room this time, and Raman brought in an Indian dinner consisting of a variety of flatbreads, dal, curries, pakoras, and spicy sauces containing lamb and hog. My father was hunched over at the table, with one shoulder raised above the other, as though he suffered from scoliosis. My father uttered, "The moral objection," again, reaching for his wine. He miscalculated the distance and almost knocked it over before he managed to grab it. Splashing a bit over his palm, his face twisted into a snarl before he tipped a large gulp down his throat and steadied his glass with both hands. There is no evil in being able to command monsters. The wickedness is in what you command them to do. But the immoral choice is to be helpless in the face of monstrosity, when you could have the power to act. So when you see the unspeakable ones emerging from the depths, the moral choice is to be helpless. If the Rakath slips from my control and attacks an infant, the moral choice is to wring your hands and curse my carelessness. So I learned to control monsters. He did not tell me, but it was evident that the same power that controlled monsters could control a human spirit. So maybe the magic I learned was intrinsically evil, or maybe there were other lessons I could have been taught to help me resolve the crisis he had described without infringing on the sacredness of another person's will. Was I really merely using the word sanctity? If so, perhaps there was something I really did believe in. If he had done this on my first visit, I would have assumed it was to get rid of me. But this time, I wondered what I would have seen if he had tried to go walking in public with me. He was unsteady just moving about his apartment. That day, he sent me on my own to do my New York tourist event, walking the High Line, while he remained behind to attend to some affairs. The news had also changed. There had been multiple assassinations that resembled John Mercer's. Several had been high-ranking public officials, always making room for someone more radical. Some seemed senseless, like a couple of homeless people or a teenage boy strolling alone after dark. My father could control the Rakath, but what did it do when he was not controlling it? All of them were suffocating, with no facial or neck bruising. Police were looking into whether or not they were the work of a single assassin, and the death of John Mercer had been flipped to homicide. After a month, 4 of his geezer friends showed up for the first time in a long time. We headed to the parking garage at the base of the structure, where my father moved obliquely and with a cane, moving in a crab-like, jerky shuffle that required several tries to get right. The geezers stayed away from him, and we gathered in a circle around his Maserati. "We're going to do something really easy today, Nickel. We're going to lift my car." I could already levitate items, but I was much too weak to lift anything larger than a medium-sized dog. "You are going to link us together and use our collective power to do this," he declared. "You want us to give her our power?" A scowling old man questioned. My father said, "Then you'll drop it on someone's head. I haven't decided who." "Yes, exactly," I replied. "I don't think I need to understand how to wield another person's authority. You would rather be defeated individually in the face of great terror than triumphant as a group. Please, Nicole, we know you are smarter than this, and I am short on patience. If we pass on dropping the car on Sasha, can we at least lift it?" asked my father. I decided to comply with it. I raised the magical whirling circle after learning the incantation. Thankfully, my tongue did not develop into a tentacle, but I lifted that Maserati and molded the power. I raised it, albeit the manner I put it back down could require some suspension work. My dad was happy with that. Not so much me. Please understand that I had fun picking up the automobile. The surge of endorphins that comes from carrying a ton of metal over your head is incredible, let me tell you, but that was precisely the issue. I was being tempted into my father's authority. I used to tell him no whenever he tried to teach me something new, but eventually I picked up on his lessons and enjoyed learning about them. I enjoyed knowing it so much that it scared me. 4 days later, my father gave me a call. He had a thick, raspy voice. "I must see you. Currently." "What?" I asked. "Are you insane? I recently saw you." "That can't wait." I said, "If you agreed to forego Mom's possible weekend visit, which is the next regular visit." Albeit I had my doubts, it was a losing argument to do anything just because my dad wanted it. My father growled, "It's too late for this weekend. This is significant." I considered asking him to try to talk my mother into it, but changed my mind. I was aware of his potential. I refused to give him permission to harm my mother in that way. He said, Ramon is on his way to pick you up. I told him, I have school tomorrow. This evening will teach you more than a full year of school could. At 9:30, he ought to be there. Go outside and get into the rental car that pulls up in front when you receive a text. Nickel, please don't fail me. And what am I meant to say to Mom? An odd noise, something between a grunt and a roar, came from my father. Pops. His tone was strained and tightly modulated. I wouldn't share anything with your mother. However, you can later justify your behavior by claiming, I told you I was dying. Are you in? The call has ended. Packed a change of clothing into a rucksack, afraid and angry, and for the first time felt some sympathy for my mother. This was the height of my father's manipulation. If he wasn't actually going to die, he was going to. While I waited, I went into the bathroom and used my black eyeliner to draw an elder sign on my breastbone, directly above my heart. I didn't think that drawing was good enough. So I did another one below. I didn't like that one either. So I did a third, just over my solar plexus. I was wondering if that was good enough when the text came. I had no idea what was going to happen. However, the thought of all those powers roiling under my father's jacket bursting out of control did not sound like a peaceful end. This way. I quickly put on my seatbelt, grabbed my backpack, and rushed outside, where I saw a big Lincoln Town car waiting. I jumped in, and before I could get my seatbelt on, Ramon drove off, shockingly appearing in front of us with flashing lights. Holy crap, I exclaimed. There's not much time, Ramon remarked as we proceeded past a red light with our police escort. Yes, but you can't just call the cops and say, I need an escort because I'm in a hurry. Did my father know the appropriate people, or had he simply captured someone's soul? After pulling down into the entry and jumping out, we arrived in 30 minutes, which is half the time it takes my mother. The doorman had the elevator waiting and the door open. You don't have to do this, Ramon murmured as we ascended. The right thing to do would have been to stay at home if I wasn't going to see my father, but I didn't comprehend what he was saying. He said, you walk out the door at any time you need to, and I'll get you home. Yes, I replied, since it appeared appropriate. When the doors to my father's apartment opened, 4 elderly men appeared scared and tired as they stood in the corridor. One of them said, Thank God, which I found to be quite humorous. How is he? Inquired Ramon. Beyond what our abilities allow. He murdered Petro. When I first arrived at the library, I couldn't figure out what was inside. A maze of long, wet things that looked like tentacles, snakes, or intestines. There was a dress shoe in the center of the floor, along with a shredded suit jacket, and when I saw that a foot was still inside the shoe, I realized that something massive was inside. Dangling from several ropey bits was an enormous mouth that was large enough to swallow my head and had sharp teeth instead of lips. The voice called out to me, Nickel, was my father's. It wasn't coming from his mouth, so I moved in closer. My father's head was tucked into a corner, twitching like a pair of balloons until they released their air. He said, Thank you for coming. The gray objects were his lungs. What can I do to help you? I asked. He struggled to breathe and murmured, I need someone to give my power. His eyes did not meet mine, and I wondered if he was able to see. It's not what I want, I said. Something like a black talon lifted what looked to be a thigh, possibly Petro's thigh, and its lifeless mouth bit into the flesh. A long, slow breath left the lungs. No one else can hold it. You have to take it. I remarked, It seems like it didn't work out too well for you. I am giving it to you whole. It won't destroy you. I made mistakes. I had no teachers. I had to build my power, sacrificing over and over at every misstep. It will be better for you. Select another, I commanded. You are my hair, my father said, his head slowly rotating as if it were controlled by a twisting cord. What do you think we've been doing all this time? The way is prepared for you and you alone. If you do not take it, all will be lost. I answered, Sucks to be you then. The squirmy parts and tentacles writhed and reached. Dropping the thigh, The talon quested toward the doorway where I was standing. A hand touched my arm. "Ramon." I refused to be turned down, he bellowed. "You will be a vessel if you are not a willing heir. Grab her." I jerked my arm away from Ramon. One of the old men grabbed my wrist, but I'd taken a good self-defense class in middle school, so he let go. Another man flailed for my arms, but his brains blew out one side of his head with a loud pop, so my shoulder got splattered. Ramon turned his gun on the fourth man, who was too scared to move, but his hesitation left him between me and the library. The talon latched into his back, dragging him backwards through the doorway and out of the way. "No," I yelled, and I used the magic my father had taught me to slam the pocket door across the opening and hold it tight. Before he could pry it open, I drew an elder sign on the door and stuck my finger in the blood and brains on my shoulder. On the first attempt, something struck the door so forcefully that the entire wall trembled, but it was unable to break through. "You succeeded," cried Ramon. A slight relief came over me when I noticed that two of the elderly guys were still conscious, but lying down and appearing too preoccupied to cause any bother. Ramon remarked, "Let's just go. Your father can't do much as he is, and he won't last long." Something whipped around my ankle and neck, causing the wall to burst in plaster dust. I was brought face to face with my father's head and jerked off my feet as additional things wrapped around me, all except one flailing arm entirely in his control. Clever girl. It would have worked if I hadn't already laid pathways into your mind. I knew it would come to this. I'd always known. Now my power, my will, shall continue with you as a vessel. "You tried to stop me with an elder sign on your belly," he asked. "Indeed," I asked. "Well then, would you please utter the magic words?" Ramon came tiptoeing through the wreckage, but I held on anyway, not willing to take a chance on him reviving. With my one free hand, I grabbed his windpipe and squeezed. The tentacles yanked me every which way, but I twisted my hand in the tube of gristle. His eyes bugged out, his mouth worked soundlessly. The tentacles smashed me against the wall, but my father's head flung with me. He must have stunned himself because everything went limp. Ramon urged, "Come on, let's get you out of here." The doormen ignored a lot of things, but not this. I peered at the gore all around me, which looked like a lawnmower had taken my father's body apart. It's impossible for me to flee from this situation. The police, and they both know that I was here. People who are guilty flee. Placing a hand over his brow, he murmured, "You're right." I said, "I'm 14. No one is going to believe I'm responsible for this. I'm the helpless victim." I looped a loop across a loop and drew it tight in a knot, just to make sure. My hand was still twisted in my father's windpipe. After some time, Ramon and I managed to come up with a story for the police that mostly involved us not knowing what had happened in the library and not offering an explanation for the gore. The police would have to come up with an explanation of what had happened in order to charge us with the crime, which did not seem possible. The only difficult problem to solve was Sasha's death, whom Ramon had shot. To get around this, we made up a story about two men breaking through the wall and claiming that Sasha must have been working with them to cover their escape, accusing him of harming the other geezers and claiming that Ramon had killed him in self-defense. We had no idea how my father had been dismantled and had not seen it. We believed we had a compelling tale. The police detective was a round little man with thick glasses who studied everything through them, first glancing at the hole in the wall and then tearing into our story, asking why it had taken us an hour to call the police, how the two men had crashed through a solid plaster wall like they were driving a bulldozer, and why there was an elder sign on the library door. I had assumed that at the mention of magic, he would brush off my explanation as ridiculous, but to my amazement, he responded as though he believed me when I talked about my father's interest in black magic and said that I was scared, so I drew the sign in the hopes that it might work. Prior to or subsequent to their wall breaking, he insisted. I stopped, realizing that I had created the symbol using Sasha's blood and brains, which indicated that I had done so after Sasha had been slain. "So why didn't they come through the door?" he asked, examining the door. I didn't respond to him. Well, it makes sense if you wrote the sign beforehand, and it guards against magic. When they were unable to enter through the entrance, they passed through the wall. But why didn't they enter through the entrance if you hadn't yet drawn the sign? I'm not sure, I replied. He asked, why did you draw the sign on the door? I explained. I told you. You're scared of what's in the room. Okay, that makes sense. But it seems to me that if it were me, I would be afraid of what might come through the big gaping hole in the wall. Right? But you drew the sign on the door. He turned to face me and said, you were afraid, right? But you see, they'd just come through the wall. Right? Bang, crash, the wall falls down. 2 men run out. Our narrative had collapsed. The investigator continued, I got 3 dead men in this apartment. Are you going to tell me what really happened? Gazed upon him, his tearful eyes, his glossy hair, and his unremarkable, yet holy humanity. This may be avoided by me. I was able to. I could say something like, Detective, I'm a teenage girl whose father was horribly murdered, after saying a few unprintable words. I knew I shouldn't have done it, but I also knew what would happen if I hadn't. Believe me, and let me go home. Thus did.